Chapter 24. Ill news. Caleb rushed through the doors to the council room as quietly as he could, and tapped his forehead in thanks when he found the room empty, save for a few maidservants who were straightening the chairs around the stretched table at the center of the room. A miracle! All of the guards must have been summoned to the Queen's entrance. They could be coming up here right this minute. He looked frantically around the room. At the head of the long council table stood a fireplace and an armchair larger than the others situated around the table. Otherwise, the room held several bookshelves and two life-size statues of nameless women. The far wall was lined with windows that looked out over the city, all veiled with tall, lightly colored curtains. Behind the curtains. No. Too risky. His eyes went up. Sure enough, a web of crossing wooden beams spread across the ceiling just as Julam had said, and the shadows seemed dark enough that they just might be able to provide concealment, but from where he stood in the light he could not be sure. All of the maidservants were looking at him now, and he acted at once. "All of you out," he shouted, waving his arms. "The Queen comes and demands privacy. Attend to your other duties." His efforts were half-hearted as he continued to study the space above him, but they all scurried out as if he were driving them with a whip. As they left, he ran to the doors to close them tightly and glanced down to the main floor. He was relieved to see nobody coming up the stairs, but the front of the hall was now a cluster of red cloaks and armor. He shut the doors and turned back to find a way up. The closest wooden beam to his head was 5 paces out of reach of his jump. His heart pounded as he briefly entertained the thought of turning back. It was a gamble. Trying for cover could mean his life. He raced to one of the bookshelves to use as a ladder. He scrambled up the shelves, being careful not to put too much weight on them and cause them to snap. It wobbled as he perched on the top of it, but he was able to grab hold of the thick rafter easily and pull himself all the way up. He would surely be seen from where he was, and his heart sank as he saw that there were only 2 more beams above him to climb before he would hit the top of the room. The sounds from down in the hall drawing nearer kicked him into action. Up he went in a bustle, until he reached the top rafter and shimmied across it to one of the corners of the room. He had a good enough view of the entire room from where he was situated now in the corner, but he still doubted if the shadows concealed him enough. Fate. There is no going back now. They could walk in any moment. If they see me up here, I'll be killed on the spot. I am sure of it. By Queen Tamara herself. And if they don't see me, how long will I have to keep my balance up here in utter silence? Hours? The slightest noise could cost me my life. There has to be somewhere else. There has to be a better way. His eyes shot across the room and through the rafters all around him in desperation, until they locked onto the corner across from him to his left. It seemed darker and further from the torches lit below. He shifted his balance and pulled his sword further back on his belt and stood up. He began making his way quietly and carefully across the beams around the edge of the wall, not wanting to be caught in the middle of them if the doors were to open. As luck would have it, he had moved no more than 10 paces when the doors, which were directly below him now, opened suddenly. In poured 5 armored Talgarth men. Caleb froze where he stood, hunched over in the ceiling between the corner he had left and the darker one at the other end of the room, and gritted his teeth. The crowds had completely dissipated by the time Anselm, Alastra and Leothran got back to the anchor. "How did we ever get caught up in all of this?" Alastra said, as they followed the path through the narrow alley to the back of the inn. "That is a question I have asked myself many times since I fell into captivity," Leothran said. "Fate's will is mysterious. It is beyond our understanding." "I don't know," Anselm said, as he pictured the seer tarn in his satchel. "My theory is fate lets things be and leaves bad luck in charge." "You always manage to bring your pessimism to an all-new level, brother," Alastra said with a smirk. "I learned from the master," Anselm said to Leothran and pointed at his sister. "Let's just see to it that everything's ready for when they get back. I want to be out of this place the minute we can. I've seen enough gruels in the past few days to last me 3 lifetimes." They poked their heads into the old stable in the yard to check on the horses before heading through the back door and down the stairs to get the saddlebags ready. Anselm led the way down, but stopped dead in his tracks on the last stair, causing the women to nearly topple over him. Elastra recovered quickly, and was ready to push him the rest of the way when she looked up and saw the door. It was hanging open apace and creaking as the draft from outside came down the stairs. The wood of the door had been splintered, leaving the doorknob dangling limply. Someone had kicked it in. Anselm heard Leothran's swords slide out of their sheaths, and he and Elastra both took out their boot knives for the first time since they left Tritus. Using hexes outside was one thing, indoors was something else entirely. One misused or badly aimed hex could nearly be as dangerous for the casters as it would be for their enemies. Anselm led a single file line to the side of the door, and he shot a quick look inside the opening but saw nothing. He pushed the door open the rest of the way with his dagger and again looked in, this time inspecting more closely. The room was in shambles. The bed was overturned and the table was broken clean in half. Some of their things were scattered on the floor along with glass from the mirror by the water basin. He could see the door to the adjoining room was also broken and hanging ajar. He moved in slowly, rounding the corner of the doorframe, and Leothran came in close behind, with her two swords pointing outward in front of her, ready to parry any surprise attacks that might fly her way. All was silent, and by the time Elastra had come in, all three of them noticed the thin stream of blood running from the other room. With a quick check behind the door for any lingering intruders, they hastily moved to the door of the next room. It was similarly in disarray, and their eyes went straight to the young man lying against the corner. It was Cliff, their youthful guide who had met them in the streets of Shorewell. A sword protruded out of his belly, and one arm clutched the blade while the other hung lifeless by his side. His head was limp on his neck and sagged down to one side, causing the sliver of blood running from his mouth to drip into his lap. They all rushed to him. "The young man?" Leothran said, tapping her forehead. Anselm and his sister gave the same reverence. Elastra rolled up the sleeves of her warden robes and rubbed the scar in her palm. "You can't heal this, Anselm said. "He's already gone. Even if you could call upon the very head of the deity's order, there is nothing we can do." They all jumped when Cliff suddenly choked on a hard cough, and his eyes opened halfway. "Get away," he murmured. "You're alive. Don't talk," Elastra said. She set to work forming a second-degree healing hex with her fingers. Although doubtful it would do any good, Anselm didn't stop her. She looked at her brother as she moved her hands over the area of the wound, right palm down. Understanding her intention, Anselm placed his hand on the hilt of the sword piercing Cliff, ready to pull it free at her word. All the while, Leothran still had her swords drawn at the ready, and her head moved alternately between Cliff and the door as she kept guard. Light began to pour from Elastra's palms. Cliff's eyes had shut again, and it didn't take long before she nodded to Anselm. He yanked the blade free as quickly and cleanly as he could, and the boy jerked and cried out with such vigor it was as if he was never injured. As Elastra focused harder to seal the wound, Anselm's instincts told him to form a hex himself and assist her, but Cliff was grasping his wrist so that he could not. Elastra did all she could. For the next few minutes they were all enveloped by a white light and strong wind. At length, however, Elastra slowly closed her hands to a fist, and it all disappeared. Anselm looked at her hopefully, but she shook her head in answer. "Thank you," Cliff said in a cracked voice. The hex could not save him, but it had replenished a shred of energy into his body. Anselm had seen it many times before. It would not last long. "Who did this to you?" Leothran asked as she came closer. She had lowered her weapons during the healing, and watched with fascination. Cliff coughed again and struggled to sit up but failed and gripped his stomach. "I came." He was looking for Rembrandt. "I wouldn't talk." He made more sounds, and Anselm couldn't tell if he was struggling for more breath or attempting to laugh. "Where did he go?" Anselm asked. "We will avenge you. You will not die in vain." Cliff struggled for air, and when he looked up to answer, his eyes went past them to the door. His expression changed to sheer horror, and then he was gone. His body went limp and he slid down the wall to the floor. They all turned to the adjoining door. A man stood there who was so tall he would have had to stoop to enter. Caleb's courage to move finally returned when it was clear that the 5 armored men below him were too preoccupied with their orders to be looking around the room, let alone scanning the rafters for a silent figure. A few of them carried bundles in their arms, and the one of the 5 in charge told them to make haste and put them in their proper places on the table. As they scurried around the room, Caleb figured this was his last chance to cover the rest of the distance to the darkness. One sound and it's over. With one hand, he grasped the sword at his side and tilted it to an upright position so it would not bump against the wall as he scooted his way across the rafter, and with the other he balanced himself. Slowly, steadily he moved 1 foot a pace or so, planted it firmly and then followed with the other, all the while trying not to look down and keep his focus on the task at hand. Much like in battle, he tried to move his mind toward calm awareness so that his body and mind could work in harmony. Step by step he made his way along the wall, and was drawing nearer to the corner when suddenly, the busy men below him stopped moving, and the sounds of their creaking armor ceased, filling the room once more with silence enough to make Caleb stop momentarily. He looked down to see that they had arranged their loads on the table. Books, documents, and several large maps were organized neatly, and now the soldiers stood at attention waiting for further instructions from their overseer. "Good," he said. "I am going back now. You 4 wait here until the Queen arrives. If she dismisses you, resume your watch in the main hall." The men crossed their arms in compliance and the one who had given the order left the room, during which Caleb managed to take a few more steps. He breathed a silent sigh of relief when all of them took a spot by the doors of the room below him. The silence did not last long. The 4 remaining soldiers began to whisper amongst themselves, and Caleb went on, eyeing them and waiting for the slightest sign of a glance upward. At last he reached his goal and was able to inspect the corner more closely. He spotted a place he could crouch and be somewhat veiled behind a few intersecting beams. Even as he thought, his feet started moving again, but with his first step the metal plating on the tip of his sword sheath scraped the wall behind him, and the resulting sound was like a war horn in his ear. He froze and watched the guards. They stopped speaking and began looking around the room to find the source of the noise. That was it. Caleb could feel that in a mere second or two, their gazes would wander up and it would all be over. The entire force of Talgarth would be upon him with swords bared. In that second of disaster, the doors flew open, and the guards jumped back to attention. Without even waiting to see who entered, Caleb scrambled to his hiding place like a cat, and looked down to see Lord Marmis's bulky armor enter the room, his massive shape nearly filling the whole span of the doorframe. The shadow that enveloped Caleb now felt like a warm quilt against a winter storm, but he waited nervously to discover if his newfound security was only imagined. From his new vantage point, he could see the large chair situated at the opposite end of the table. He swallowed hard, realizing that if the Queen were to sit there, she would be facing his direction. Below, Marmius entered the room and circled around to the opposite side of the table, then turned to face the door again. Queen Tamara entered next. From where he was positioned 30 paces above her, Caleb could feel her presence like ice. A cold, empty feeling seeped into his bones, as if death had entered the room and was seeking him out. Somehow the darkness of his hiding place didn't seem so comforting anymore. From above, her flowing dark red cape draping from her shoulders looked like a rolling river of blood, as she slowly walked to one end of the table and gracefully sat down in the tall back chair at its head, crossing her legs and placing her hands on the armrests with an unearthly grace. Her black sword, the Chaos, still hung on her side and the long sheath rested on the floor. "Leave us," came Marmis's deep echoing voice. The 4 guards all crossed their arms in unison and disappeared in an instant. When the door closed, Caleb quieted his breathing. He was grateful Julam's conjecture about the council location had been correct. "You must be weary from the voyage, Your Excellency," Marmius said, turning from the door to face her. He bowed his head as he spoke. "Perhaps you would like to rest before we summon the council." There was a thick silence in the room for a moment, when suddenly she spoke. "There is no rest in war," she responded. It was the first time Caleb had heard her voice. It was deep and as beautiful as she, yet her words struck out from her lips like lightning with a power that sent an icy shiver down Caleb's back. Her voice was the embodiment of evil. It was the voice that had commanded the merciless slaughter of thousands, that had deceived and used King Rawlin and Grimhall. A flash of hatred ran through his blood. "Nor do I require it," she said, moving one hand to rest on the pommel of her sword. Her words came slowly and clearly, ringing like the toll of a bell, and they seemed to dissolve into Caleb like poison. He shifted uneasily as he listened. "I have come in urgency. The voice from beyond is aware of your exploits here, as you know, and there is much to be done. Our campaign cannot be delayed." Marmius bowed again. "What would you have me do, my queen?" "You have disposed of your general," she stated. "Yes, Highness." "And where is this man who now commands in his stead?" Marmius bowed his head lower. "He is here in the manor, Excellency, seeing to organizing his men and awaiting further orders." While Queen Tamara's voice sang amongst the rafters, Marmius was more difficult to hear as his words rattled through his mask and helmet. Caleb had to strain to hear and lost a few words here and there. "Present him to me," the queen said. "He shall play a key role in our advance. As will the gruel creature." "As you wish, my queen," Marmius said with a full bow. "The voice from beyond is wise, and I follow your command as you follow his." "He grants many great things in return," she replied. "As you are well aware, Marmius." Her hand lifted slowly, motioning to his face as she said the last. "Bring me this new general." "At once." As Marmius opened the door to instruct the guards outside, Caleb stirred, remembering the haunting words King Roland had spoken before he died. Thoughts of the Queen of Talgarth communing with specters of an unseen world surfaced to his mind with a new vile taste of possibility. What does all of this mean? The lioness follows the commands of another, one who grants great things. None of it made any sense, and yet somehow it seemed obvious that such a legendary killer as Queen Tamara came into power by the aid of unworldly means. Does she speak of the sword? At any rate, she said the man would play a part in their advance. The march of the Crimson Sun will continue then, just as we feared.
Thank you for listening. Subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss the next chapter. Episodes go live every Monday and Friday morning at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. The audiobook can be purchased in its entirety on Google Play Books. Get the whole trilogy now in both paperback and ebook formats. All links are in the description.